Hey, it's me, and welcome to TMHQ Drop Mafia. Now, you heard about this big push by the Ukrainians. Now, it turns out the Russians said that even 3 days before the Ukrainians went into that area, they had decided to pull out. And it's true that if you have the 1st Guards tank army there, you really do need a couple of days to move out. And the Ukrainians moved into a vacuum, into an empty space with some remnants there, but basically they had no opposition. And that is supposed to be heroic. Whatever, these people are so hard up. But the same happened in the Kyiv area, if you remember. After about a month after Russia went into Ukraine, Russia suddenly took off from the Kyiv area, and everybody's like, what? But of course, the Ukrainians painted it as a victory, right? We pushed them out, but no. As soon as the Russians left, the Ukrainians moved in, and they were acting like we drove the Russians away. But why would the Russians leave valuable real estate like the Kyiv area, the Kharkov area, which is what they just did? Well, it's called the jumping killer frog strategy. And it's kind of hard to explain, so I put up some little MS Paint maps. You can always pause the video to look at what I'm trying to explain. But you have to understand that the Russians built a small force for the special operation, not their best troops. And most of it is DPR and LPR militias, Chechens, mercenaries. But you do have Russian infantry there, but not that many. And the idea is that at the onset, you don't just put your 200,000 troops at the Donbass and face off against 200,000 Ukrainians like it's the Middle Ages, right? Let's go to a field, right? But no. What the Russians did is they attacked on multiple fronts, thereby splitting the 100% of the Ukraine armed forces into many parts. And as you can see on the MS Paint maps, that 100% at first is 200,000, then 150,000, then 100,000. Because what happens is, as time moves on, they're degrading the head count. They're counting heads. They're killing heads. And when you degrade the total armed forces, the infantry they have, the people they have, you can afford to leave the Kyiv area because the mission is accomplished. Because it's very important to split up 200,000 troops. But when that becomes 150,000 troops, it's not that urgent. You can split it up in 3 instead. So they still plug their troops into the Kharkov area. But now we're 6 months in, and the Russians decided that they've killed so many Ukrainians that they're degraded down to 100,000 that you can afford to pull out of the Kharkov area. Again, the jumping frog, but at the same time, the killer frog, right? Counting heads, killing heads. And so it's only because the Ukrainian armed forces have been so degraded by now that you can just pull out of the Kharkov area, put everything behind the Donbass, and then you can see what you want to do. The one thing I decided is you cannot predict what the Russians will do because they're geniuses. There's no other way to say it, and that's why you cannot predict what they will do. But if you look at the jumping killer frog strategy, it doesn't make sense because at the onset of the special operation, you do want to make sure that you split up all the Ukrainian forces, or you're going to have a hard time because it's almost like 1-to-1. But by now, you have the Ukis losing so many people. Forget the fake KIAs that Ukraine's always reporting. The Russians lost a few thousand of their own people. The DPR and LPR militias lost a lot of people, thousands, so in total like 12,000. But the Ukrainians lost 100,000 people. And now they're even sending old people to the front and people that are not trained, recent conscripts. And it's kind of sad, right? Because these people are sent out to die. And so now Ukraine only has 100,000 troops left. It's not that much if you think about it, because they need thousands to still defend Kyiv no matter what. They still need thousands in Kharkov, thousands in Odessa, and in various other cities and towns. And they need to keep a lot of troops in the Donbass. But for the Russians, they're now down to, let's say, 185,000. And that's like a 2-to-1 now. Now they have a 2-to-1 advantage in general. And so what they're doing now in the Donbass is creating a scenario where it's 20-to-1. Yeah, I'm not even kidding about it, because, this jumping frog strategy is so nifty. It's so creative, right? The conventional wisdom is not to give up real estate. No general would do it. It's not what you do. You go into a Kyiv area. It's like, wow, we got the whole Kyiv area. We can almost take Kyiv. And then you just leave? What the hell is that? Or you're right next to Kharkov, right? Even I thought they will go into Kharkov. But that's what they wanted people to think. Because nobody would give up that real estate and then just leave. Of course, the Ukrainians move into a vacuum, into an empty space, and they're like, yeah, we're planting flags, we're winning. But it's silly. These people are so hard up. And okay, let them feel good for a while. But what I'm seeing is that the Russians were jerking these people around just like they jerk all of Europe around with the energy and making the sanctions backfire. They're also jerking the Ukrainian armed forces around and the American and British commanders that actually run the Ukrainian military. And they also did a counteroffensive in Kherson, as I talked about in one video. And 2,000 Ukrainians just died for nothing. It's so sad. I feel bad about these Ukrainians being sent out to die because of these greedy animals in Kyiv. But then also now with this bogus offensive, okay, they're moving into an empty space because the Russians just decided to take off. They're doing the jumping frog strategy, right? But there's two things that we can still count on. Number one, you cannot predict what the Russians will do next. And number two is they will still kill many Ukrainians. And there's nothing that Ukrainians can do about it. And so finally, there's an important point that I have to mention. 200,000 troops, right? 80% of that is DPR and LPR militias and Chechens, and it's not the real Russian army. And also, Putin decided from the onset they're going to have 200,000 troops, and that's it. They're not going to pour more troops into it, and they're going to be creative. They're going to do the jumping killer frog strategy. They're going to do feints, and they're going to be slow. They're going to use a lot of artillery airstrikes, because there's nothing that the Biden regime and the NATO forces would love more than to have Russians pour in more troops and more money and resources into Ukraine. And of course the Russians know that, and so they're not falling for that trap. That's why they also said it's a special operation, and they're not sending their best even. They're not sending their best equipment. They're not sending their own best troops. Of course, the Russians have hundreds of thousands of troops that they can put in, but instead, their best troops are exercising with the Indian army, the Chinese army, and those are the real troops, right? That's the real Russian army. But they did allocate some Russian troops, but mostly a lot of artillery, and the Air Force is helping out the DPR and LPR militias mostly, right? But any of us, I certainly would want to pour in more troops and show these idiots who's boss. And it's a temptation, and that's what everybody's counting on, that the Russians would do it. So the discipline that the Russians are showing by restraining themselves and being creative with what they have and sticking to the allocation, that is in itself genius. Because if you can control yourself on the battlefield in that way, then you can devise a strategy where, less is more, where you can take what you have and move the pieces around on the chessboard and still come out winning. That's amazing. It truly is amazing. And what we're seeing here is brilliance. That whole Ukraine operation, the special operation, in many ways it's so genius. Of course, the West will never, ever admit that because they're telling fairy tales. But just think of this. If things are so awesome for the Ukrainians and things are failing all the time for the Russians, then how come the Russians are not nervous, right? Why didn't they go home yet?
Shadowy flight into the dangerous world of a man who does not exist. A young loner on a crusade to champion the cause of the innocent, the helpless, the powerless, in a world of criminals who operate above the law.